Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Kristen Delkamp from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our Racial Equity series and is entitled Cultural Humility Part B. And now it is my privilege to introduce today's first presenter, Dr. Rajni Shankar Brown.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and everybody at ICF. And thank you to everybody who's here today. Welcome. If you were here last week with us, we welcome you back again. We're so grateful to be able to be in community again today. And if you are new joining us, welcome. We're going to scaffold a few concepts, but again, everything will be fully introduced, and we're so happy just to be able to pause in the frenziness of life and to be able to unpack and wrestle and to grow individually and collectively as we really work to be pushing equity and justice forward, but fully embracing cultural humility. So I'll just share really quickly. Today we have an acrylic. You all know I love art, and we have an acrylic painting here today called We Are the Light. And this is a beautiful painting. There's a lot of indigenous symbolism in it, and it's by the artist Lance Smith. But one of the things I appreciate about this painting, if you look closely, you start to see kind of constellations, but also things that have movement, things that grow. You see the moon, stars, animals, right? Creatures, the sun. And so there's a lot of hope embodied in this piece, but also the reminder of how things are interconnected, how things grow and evolve and take shape in nature, and how we are all kind of part of this process of growth and the lifelong journey of learning together. And that is a lot of cultural humility, which we're going to unpack and talk about today. So again, thank you for being here. So I'll share with you briefly, I am Rajni Shankar Brown. I am an associate at Racial Equity Partners, which was founded. You're going to get to meet the amazing Donald Whitehead in a second. I am also the president of the National Coalition for the Homeless Board. And I'm also a professor and the Jesse Ball DuPont Endowed Chair of Social Justice Education at Stetson University, which is located here in Florida. And I am just so grateful to be in this space. Cultural humility is something that has been part of my work for a very long time, a part of not only my research, but kind of life's work. I feel very connected on a personal level as well. And so it's just a joy and an honor to be in this space, to be able to share my passion, but also to continue to learn and grow with everyone here. So thank you. And I'm going to turn the mic over to the amazing Donald.
Thank you very much, Rajni, and just really appreciate all that you do for the community and for people experiencing homelessness and people who are struggling with racial equity. I'm Donald Whitehead. I am, as Rajni said, the co-founder of Racial Equity Partners, which I founded along with Jeff Olivet, who's currently the executive director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. I'm not quite as busy as Rajni, but I'm also the executive director for the National Coalition for the Homeless. I've been working on homeless and racial equity issues for a little bit over 28 years at this point, and have worked at all sectors from outreach to case management to director positions at several organizations in several cities, and have also worked on advocacy for homelessness and also racial equity, served on the Georgetown Center for Cultural Competency, and have been working on these issues, as I said, intensely for almost 30 years at this point. So really happy to be with you today. I have really enjoyed working on this project with ICF, and we thank them for their partnership, and we look forward to a great session today. So thank you very much for having us. So I'm going to go through what our agenda is for today. We're going to start with we always want you to do is we want to get to know you a little bit and we usually don't have enough time to go through everybody. So if you could put your introductions in the chat, and we'd love to see who you are, where you work, your pronouns, so that everyone on the call can get to know you. So we're going to do a little grounding first on the issue of cultural humility, and then we'll go a little deeper into humility and cultural humility. We'll look at the different dimensions, the interpersonal, the intrapersonal, and those systems. We'll discuss cultural humility principles. We'll do a little on knowledge, attitude, skills, and lifelong learning. We'll look at the humble model, ponder activity, and the benefits of cultural humility. And we'll end it with some questions and comments. This will be an interactive session, so we hope that you'll join us in our conversations, in our group, our large group settings. We'd love to hear your voices. And as we go to the next slide, want you to know that this is the second of a 3-part series. You'll learn about the continuum of cultural consciousness, cultural competence versus cultural humility, the principles of cultural humility, the benefits of embracing and practicing cultural humility, systems level application of cultural humility, promising practices, and more. And we just went through, we'll engage with the content. So these are some rules we want to make sure that you go by as we have our group discussions, and throughout. We hope that you'll honor these guidelines as we go through. We engage with the content and each other so that we maximize learning. We will be present, actively listening, and speak our truth. And what we mean there is that when you talk, you're representing yourself. You're using I statements and not we statements. So you come here as an individual, and we want to hear your reflections as an individual. We speak with positive intentions. Intentions don't equal impact on others, so we apologize when we make a mistake. We assume that the participants have good intentions until proven otherwise. We ask questions so that we can all learn from each other. And those are the engagements and grounding for what we're going to do today. And we do really hope that you'll honor all of those. So just a little bit of an overview for cultural humility. Humility is a developmental process shaped and expressed within social systems from the beginning of life. And that is by Narvaez, 2019. Want to make sure we always give credit for those that we get some of the information from. Cultural humility involves an ongoing process of self-exploration and self-critique, combined with a willingness to learn from others. It means entering a relationship with another person with the intention of honoring their beliefs, their customs, and values. It means acknowledging differences and accepting that person for who they are. And the source for that was Soundscaping Blog 2022. So just a little bit of grounding about the actual definition of cultural humility. And I'm going to pass it over to Rajni to get us started.
Awesome. So last week, with those of us who were in community really talked about cultural humility, right? And there are many different definitions that exist. You just heard Donald share one, right? And what you'll find is in all of these different kind of mosaic of definitions, a lot of times there's these kind of key concepts that continue to pop up. Lifelong learning is definitely one. Often the word of reflection, you'll even see kind of self-exploration as one. And so Turbalon and Garcia really define it. This is one of the most central kinds of definitions that is often commonly used across different fields even. And they describe it as a process that requires humility, that each of us has something of great value to learn from the other, as individuals continually engaging in self-reflection, engaging in self-critique, as lifelong learners and reflective practitioners. But here's the other big part, right? We are using that self-reflection and that self-critique to really redress power, to go back and challenge power imbalances, to develop mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic partnerships in an ethic of care, right? Really care. And so Melanie Tervalon and Jan Marie Garcia coined cultural humility again in 1998. And they were really healthcare professionals who had a passion and were really focused on multiculturalism at the time, and really this idea of advancing equity. How do we do that? And they initially started by examining healthcare spaces to say we have a number of inequities. We have a number of ways that many patients from diverse cultures do not feel included. They feel disconnected. They often feel a lot of data coming back saying we don't feel heard. We don't feel that often our own physical illnesses are really being tended to, or a medical doctor is really listening or understanding us from our own frame of experiences, the own culture that we bring. And so all of this really got them to start thinking about cultural humility, but specifically moving cultural humility apart from cultural competence, which in the healthcare field was the big focus. Now, we know that since then, right, there have been many professional codes of ethics and cultural humility that now have come out. And a lot of codes of ethics in different fields now explicitly start to state that cultural humility is in fact imperative. An example would be the Code of Ethics from the National Association of Social Workers. Originally in their Code of Ethics, there was no mention of cultural humility during the 90s. But if you've kept up with kind of the evolution of that in the 2000s, right, all the way up into 2008 and since, cultural humility has really been emphasized. The same is true in occupational therapy. If you look at the National Occupational Therapy Association standards, you can see the same in education and even in counseling practices. And so there's a lot of understanding now that cultural humility is really important, right? And what we know, again, is that it does not start with an examination of others' cultures or an examination of they, them, which is what cultural competence often focused on, right? It's this idea that, to be culturally competent, I'm going to go out and I'm going to learn and try to understand other cultures, right? And it starts from that basis of looking outward at they, them. Cultural humility is different, right? Because it starts first with ourselves, with saying that, I want to understand and learn about other cultures, but to do that and to do that with integrity, I've also got to start by first unpacking my own biases, the biases that I carry, right? I have to do self-reflection, self-critique, and it has to be an ongoing process of really compassionate self-awareness, understanding that all of us as human beings, we are flawed, right? We're going to make mistakes. We may not always have all the answers, but we can commit to growing. We can commit to a process of lifelong learning. And so one of the things this week, we really want to go deeper into understanding cultural humility. And so if you were with us last week, you're going to hear a little bit of that grounding, but we're going to be taking it really kind of much deeper this week. And if you're joining us again, just for the first time, just feel free to dive in. And if you have questions as we go or comments, feel free to use the chat box as well. As Donald said earlier, we're going to have some interactive moments throughout this, and this really is a collective space. So one of the things we know is cultural humility intentionally works at understanding our own worldviews and any oppression or discrimination that we may also cause intentionally or unintentionally and also understand our own experiences. But then from there, you're working to understand the experiences, the lived stories, the lived pains and joys and anguish, and especially the diverse cultures of people around you, of communities around you. But in order to do that, we also have to understand our own lenses, our own experiences that have shaped our journeys. And so it's this kind of bi-directional kind of movement and very dynamic. You're kind of going in and out, right? In and out with this reflective process. Now, again, while cultural humility was formed in physical healthcare, it has now really been used to improve interactions in many different fields, not just medical professionals and patients. It's now been adopted in numerous fields, including systems change, community organizing and advocacy, education, social work, counseling, and library sciences. And we know we have hosts of research now showing us that cultural humility has many benefits and can positively impact service outreach and practice, right? And it especially helps us start to ask some of the bigger, more challenging questions that we have to be able to ask in this work, including how do we tackle the many isms that exist? So I have a video here to share, and this is a 30-minute video. So we're not going to play the full 30 minutes, just the first 5 minutes really. But you can go and check this video out. We'll put the link in the chat box for you if you want to go and watch the whole thing, right? But I bring this video up, and Donald and I really like this because the initial beginning part, you get to hear some diverse perspectives and voices, including, right, the original founders who coined the term cultural humility, right? So you're going to get to hear Tervalan and Murray Garcia's voices as well.
One word to describe cultural humility for me is love, actually. If I had to encapsulate cultural humility, the whole concepts of cultural humility, it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence.
Escuchar.
Being. You.
Opening.
Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal. Yes, our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward.
Cultural humility that is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Tervalan and I conceptualized 3 dimensions.
The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in that critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own history.
Rajni, you got muted in it. Stop the video sound.
In that history, my parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am.
The second tenet after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician patient or clinician client or service provider community dynamics.
And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
An African-American nurse is caring for a middle-aged Latino woman several hours after the patient had undergone surgery. A Latino physician on a consult service approached the bedside and, noting the moaning patient, commented to the nurse that the patient appeared to be in a great deal of post-operative pain. The nurse summarily dismissed his perception, informing him that she took a course in nursing school in cross-cultural medicine and knew that Hispanic patients overexpress the pain that they're feeling. The Latino physician had a difficult time influencing the perspective of this nurse, who focused on her self-proclaimed cultural expertise.
It was curious to this Latino physician who, first of all, was Latino, not like all, in his case, not like all Mexican Americans know everything there is to know about Mexican American patients. That wasn't it, but he might have been a resource for that African American nurse in that moment that she didn't feel like she needed, again, because she had bought into this notion of competence, of cultural competence.
The distinction between cultural humility and cultural competence was that we were in a process and a relationship that had many other layers to it, and that we were less comfortable with with even the term of competence, in a way that I think people understand well, and that it implies, especially for people who are providers and are trained in academia, that you are then all knowing and all powerful. And we felt like that was not what was happening for us as we were learning from community and understanding in a very practical way how families were coming to the hospital and feeling as if they really were not being heard from their own heritage and history, and how that impacted what they came to the hospital with that we didn't know anything about, hadn't even a clue about. For us, this is part of the humility piece of it, getting to understand that I'm not trying to humiliate you, I'm not trying to make you feel bad, trying to help us all understand that life is like this, and to, in a certain sense, be really happy about not knowing.
In April of 1992, in the wake of the Los Angeles
you got to hear there both Melanie Turbalon and Jan Marie Garcia. First of all, see them and hear their voice, right? And so I wanted to take a second to honor them as these beautiful, strong women, right, who came up with the concept of cultural humility. But also, we had some good examples there, right, of cultural humility and the kind of impetus to somewhat separate it from cultural competence and the reason why. And so we know that, again, there are some big differences. Now, cultural humility, one of the really, really great things is it starts to look at not only trying to understand ourselves and other cultures, but also starts to do some of the bigger tackling of bigger systems issues. Right, so there's a big piece in cultural humility where you see here in this image and diagram, right? And you start to look at the different bases and scaffolding up, but there's a big commitment to understanding and addressing power imbalances. So first of all, holding systems accountable, right? Saying, how can I work on an institutional level to ensure that the systems I am part of move towards greater inclusion and equity, right? Asking that question, such an important question. And then also cultural humility pushes us to say, let's try to understand and also address those power imbalances that show up. How can I use the understanding of my own and others' cultures to identify and work to disrupt inequitable systems? One of the things I've loved about so many of these workshops, right, that ICF has been able to do, partnering with various, communities of folks, including REP, right, is really starting to say, let's build spaces where we ask these critical questions. Right? And whether it is about, thinking about equal access rule, whether it is thinking about really pushing ourselves to understand even how colorism ends up showing up, right? In different practices and policies and structures and spaces, again, moving from different levels, right? All the way from interpersonal into the systemic. So even when we're thinking about the isms, one of the things cultural humility asks us to do it calls on us to start to understand our own connection to some of these much larger structures and practices and even the isms, right? So even thinking about racism, the pervasive system of privilege, of oppression, based on socially constructed categories of race that has resulted, right, in glaring, disparate, oppressive outcomes for Black and Brown people. Understanding how that works and operates, and right, and how is it showing up in our own communities, in our own systems and work. And of course, we only have to look at overrepresentation, again, when we think about homelessness, right? The overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and even Asian communities, right? There is large overrepresentation when we start to look at people experiencing homelessness. Now, looking specifically at the state of California, right? If you start to really dig in, you really see this magnified at all sorts of levels, right? From looking at our tribal nations to our Black communities, to even Asian that are often left out of communities. There are many communities with Vietnamese, Hmong, Bengali communities that are often, again, not left out. And so cultural humility says, let's learn. Let's critically start to ask some questions and dig a bit deeper into this work. And also, again, continue to go back into the reflective work into ourselves that is needed to kind of unpack, right? And so in addition to racism, understanding ableism, systems of oppression that disadvantage and continue to hurt and exclude people who have disabilities. And at the same time, starting to understand, if you look again at this triangle, right? Starting to also say, how do we also look and understand deeper systems that are working to maintain the status quo that often end up marginalizing and hurting people from diverse communities, right? So kind of understanding the tension that exists there. The same with cissexism, right? So cissexism, the systems of oppression that value cisgender individuals and uphold gender binary, marginalizes and makes invisible and harms, right, some people's lives and experiences, including trans, intersex, non-binary. And cultural humility also calls on us to start to understand the intersections, right? When we're talking about racial equity, how does that connect even as we think about isms such as heterosexism, such as cissexism? So thinking about classism, sexism, heterosexism, religious bias, linguistic oppression, all of these kinds of connections, this web of connection as well. And it's hard work, right? So cultural humility also acknowledges This is hard work and it's messy work. And, it's complicated sometimes, right? And we're not going to be perfect in this work, but we can make a commitment that we're going to continue to try to grow and to understand. And we're going to try to be lifelong learners. I love, Veronica, that your high school has creating lifelong learners as its motto, right? What a beautiful motto to embody and to take with us in life, right? That we can all be lifelong learners. And so we know cultural humility is dynamic. It is continuous. It is multi-directional and multidimensional, right? Directional and multidimensional. And of course, last week, you may remember we started to talk about culture. Even when we think about culture, what does that word mean? Right, and we looked at it from many different perspectives. Donald gave us a lot of different examples, right, of what culture looks like. That it's this umbrella term that often encompasses social behaviors, encompasses norms, knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, institutional practices, even habits, right? Things that become norms, that become habits, and habits that again start to normalize. Right? Things in individuals and groups and in human societies. So when we talk about even cultural norms, right? When you hear the term cultural norm, how do you define that? What do you think? Maybe share with us, if you will, in the chat box, right? What do you think of when you hear the term cultural norm, right? Or what's an example of a cultural norm? Okay, thank you, Danielle. Danielle says stereotypes, right? So often cultural norms often can lead, right? There's a direct connection there to stereotypes. That's really great. Miriam says patterns of behavior and expectation promoted and enforced within a group. Awesome, really well said. Thank you, Miriam. Melissa says mainstream, right? Kind of what's mainstream. These are all really, really great. Thank you all so much for sharing. And so absolutely, right? When we talk about cultural norm, we're thinking about codes for acceptable conduct in society. That is what, society has deemed as acceptable. And the same is within an organization or a space, right? And schemas, absolutely, Veronica, awesome, right? Veronica says schemas, we don't even realize, right? Some snaps for that. We don't even realize. And that we are expected, right, with our interactions, right, with the restaurant staff. Staff. Alejandra, thank you. Acceptable practices by groups of individuals. These are all wonderful, ways to look at this, right? And we have even, often even from an educational perspective, we talk about something called the hidden curriculum. That there's these kind of, expectations that exist that often aren't explicitly spoken about. And so cultural norms, again, often operate from kind of dominant stances or perspectives, right? They often embody and operate from white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, financially secure, often Christian, English speaking, even thin, if you want to think about body size in this, right? There's these kind of dominant kinds of norms that have been set up in a number of ways, right? From media, from legacies, historical legacies that have been translated from our schooling system, right? Things that are taught, both from explicit curriculum, but also hidden curriculum. And again, the media plays a huge role as well. And what we know is, right, often when we're operating from these kind of cultural dominant norms, the viewpoints can unleash harm on diverse cultures, diverse communities, diverse people, right? And it's not always intentional, unintentional as well, but nonetheless can cause harm. And that's where cultural humility, again, it comes back to ask us all to reflect on our own practices, right? Our own way of being, our own lenses, the own way, the way we're interacting with others. And so here in this diagram, and I see some more great things in the chat. Thank you all so much, right? And here in the diagram, right, you start to see some different words that are being played with. Intrapersonal, interpersonal. So if you start to look at this, this is really comes from the tripartite model of cultural humility. So it's one model, there's many different models. This comes out of the work of Hayes Janes in 2021, really looking at this diagram to say from an intrapersonal stance, right? We're looking at things from an inward stance. So here we're thinking about, in terms of cultural humility, reflection, self-reflection. We're thinking about self-critique. We're thinking about building awareness, self-awareness of our own actions, our own practices, our own words that we use, right? Our own assumptions when we walk into spaces, right? What shows up and where is that coming from? So taking that deep dive intra-personally. And you see the arrows go into a circle, right? Again, reminding us that this is a dynamic process, that this is in fact a continuous process, and it should be, right, a lifelong commitment. That we don't just do the reflection one time a year and we say, whoop, okay, we're done for the year, we're good, right? That's not how it works. That it has to be a commitment to kind of doing ongoing reflection and critique and awareness. And as we're embodying and learning in the outward, in the external, from other people, from people's lived experiences, which is one of the biggest pieces of cultural humility, that one of the great ways that we can learn and grow is to value and honor lived experience, right? And to be able to listen to lived experience and integrate that. And so you start to see again here, this overlap in the Venn diagram with intrapersonal and interpersonal. The interpersonal starts to look at relationships, right? What is the relationship we have? If we are, an educator, right? If Veronica working at a high school, or a counselor, what is the relationship? If we are working in an agency where we're doing street outreach, what are those relationships that we are building in encampment sites, right? So thinking about relationships, how is our interactions, right, in those outward relationships? But again, still thinking about that in connection to the intrapersonal. And then thinking about advocacy and activism, challenging power imbalances. This is also a really imperative part of cultural humility, that we're not just being humble and open to learning, but we take what we learn and we apply and we use it to hopefully work to advance equity and to advance justice. And so there's this kind of openness and accountability that bridges both of these, that we're going to be open to understanding our own messy selves, and we're going to be open to understanding others' experiences and truths and realities and layered stories. And we're also going to hold ourselves and hold others, including the organizations and communities that we work and live in, accountable, right? And so again, cultural humility is dynamic, it's continuous, it's multi-directional, it's multi-dimensional. This comes out of some of the research that I've been doing. And it's something that connects again back into Janes's model here, because in order for all of this to be true, it asks us to have a very deep understanding of the intrapersonal and the interpersonal. Intrapersonal dimensions of cultural humility, you see again, right, include all of these. And even though they're showed here in silos for understanding, the reality is they're all deeply connected and interwoven. And hopefully we're moving through all of this, very symbiotically at times, as well as taking time to go deeply into each of these areas. I'm going to turn the mic over back to Donald.
Thank you, Rashni, and thank you for just a beautiful overview of the genesis of cultural humility, and also just a really in-depth journey into it. And so when we think about what cultural humility is and our social identities and their intersectionality and self-reflection, it's all of these things. And I'm sorry, there's some background noise here. But there are thinking styles, our language, our ethnicity, our religion, our perspectives on things, the world, how we deliver our services in our organizations, our different experiences over time within those organizations, and our companies and our nationality. We think about how we exist in our nationality, which is very different sometimes with where we are in this world, where we are geographically, how we exist in that space. Our job level, what kind of power dynamic is created in the space that we work in, that level that we work in, how that impacts our own identity and our intersectionality. Of course, race and culture and our skill sets. What are we bringing to the table, and how does that land within that power dynamic? Our gender and the differences, the isms again that we face based on our gender, and how we are our power dynamic in the world is identified by ourselves and those around us. And then our physical abilities. We talked about the isms. We talked about so many different dynamics within the isms of this world. There is a lot of disability ism. There's a lot of times in our world that, because of what we bring to the table, whether it's substance abuse or other kinds of disabilities and physical abilities, we're judged by that, and it does reflect on our station in the world. Our sexual orientation, we talked a lot about that last week, and how we're still growing. As we said, cultural humility is dynamic and it's lifelong learning. So in the last few years, we've learned a lot about sexual orientation and how people feel about it and want to be addressed. And we're continuing to learn as people express themselves more strongly in a different way. The other ism is ageism, and how in our world, how that particular ism is actually placed within the dynamic of our world and our identity. And all of these things are part of our identities and our self-reflection. And in cultural humility, we have to be able to dig deeply enough to be able to understand where we are based on all of these things. So all of these things are a part of our reality, of our self-identity. All those things come into play. And as we do an introspective look at ourselves, we start to understand where we are in this world, in the power dynamic, in the power sharing dynamic, based on all of these things. And it's very different for everybody, but it's so important that we know where we stand in order to be able to learn how it affects other people as we go through our work, as we do the work of providing services for homeless individuals. We have to think about all these dynamics at the same time. So the next slide, we have to ask ourselves also these questions, and I'm going to give it back to Rajni in a second to talk a little bit about the picture on your left, but some of the self-reflection and awareness questions we need to be asking ourselves is, what identities do you think about most often? Again, is it one of those identities? Is it your physical ability? Is it your nationality? Is it your race, your gender? What identities do you think about most often? What identities do you think about least often? What part of you, of that circle of things we just looked at, do you identify with the least often? Are these identities visible or invisible? So we have the physical parts of our identity, our race, sometimes, because our race can be very dynamic. Sometimes people make the wrong guesses about our race, but there are some very visible parts of how we look and how we're able to move through the world physically, are these visible or invisible identities, and things like your religion are invisible for most people, unless you're in the practice of that religion. A person can't walk up to you and immediately identify what your religion or your sexual orientation is in most cases. So are these identities visible or invisible? What identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? Sometimes that's about your job title. Sometimes it's about your race. Sometimes it's about your culture, your nationality. All of these things have an effect on how people perceive you, but what has the greatest effect for you? So these are all the questions as we determine who we are and we do self-reflection and awareness. These are the questions that we have to self-interrogate. We have to interrogate ourselves to kind of understand where we are in this world, where we are within the power dynamic of this world, and how those identities really shape how we move through life, how many barriers we face as we move through life, and how we can start to understand those in others. And Rajni, I know you want to talk about the kaleidoscope.
Yeah, thank you so much, Donald. So yeah, so if you look, I was going to ask you, what do you think that is, right? But it's the inner workings of a kaleidoscope. And so my own daughter, Ramila Sitara, she's gotten into this. She loves to make her own kaleidoscopes now, which is really fun. She takes kind of recycled materials and makes them. But if you look inside of them, right, as you're turning, if you've ever used a kaleidoscope, when you turn it, the inner image just completely changes. Right? And you'll see some things that are similar, but it morphs and changes. And so I like to use a kaleidoscope as a metaphor, because I think it reminds us, especially as we're thinking about cultural humility, of the vast diversity, the intersectionality of identities, right? And the dynamic nature of culture and cultures. And there are multiple variables interacting in any different social context that often requires us to be humble, to be open, to be ready to say we're going to embrace lifelong learning because we don't know everything, right? And we don't have all the answers. And sometimes we kind of assume, or even going back to someone who mentioned earlier about stereotypes, right? We have these things, these narratives that often play in our head, right? But when we step into the world, each time those interactions and experiences, it's almost like a kaleidoscope, because there's going to be different variables that end up changing, right? And so I actually have a book project now, and I use the kaleidoscope as this metaphor. And it really, to me, it speaks to thinking about that, right? How we have to be humble, and that each has its own beauty, right, in its formation, if we take the time to pause and to observe and to study and to reflect. But this becomes really important, right? Because the self-reflection, these questions Donald just went over, right? That we actually had you all kind of do in small groups last time, adding this into our own regular practice of reflection becomes so important, because the answers, some of them might be very stable no matter where we are. There may be identities we're always thinking about, but some of these also may change and shift depending on the social context or environment that we are in, right? So an example I can give you is, there's a lot of identities that I carry that are outside of kind of dominant norms. When I'm in certain spaces, an example would be if I'm with committee members, with Donald and different folks in the National Coalition for the Homeless. Some of those identities of mine, I don't think about as often, because the space is a lot more inclusive, right? Where I really feel welcome. I feel part of a community. And so I'm able to kind of drop the heavy weight of some of those identities I carry. Whereas in other spaces, an example would be at my university, it's a predominantly white institution. So a lot of times I'm sitting in spaces where I am the only person of color, or often in certain leadership spaces, I'm the only woman, right? And so these are identities where it is right there and I'm feeling it, right, in all kinds of ways. Sometimes because of microaggressions, sometimes because of the macro things going on, right? But that's the thing, right? Our identities show up and they affect us in different ways. And the identities that have the greatest effect on how others perceive you also changes, right? It may be very different based on a variety of things, right? How, based on even, how in that community we show up, but also based on maybe historical relationships within a community, right? Where do they even trust building? In some communities, it's going to take a lot more to build that trust, because there may have been trust that was injured or harmed in various ways if you're working with an agency, for example, right? And you're having to rebuild that trust. Whereas in other communities, if people have had a positive experience, it may be easier to go in and to continue to build relationships. So again, thinking about that kaleidoscope, thinking about why cultural humility is so important, and we're asked to kind of do ongoing reflection and unpacking, especially knowing that, again, the environment and context is constantly changing, and people, right, have different dynamics that show up in different ways as well, right? All of us as human beings. So I love that. And these questions Donald shared, right? These are some good questions. And there's a lot of questions like this that I think being intentional in our lives to pause and think about is really important, and something cultural humility calls on us for. Yeah, Donald.
Well, and I also just wanted to share, since we're doing this in the arena of homeless services, emergency services, think about these same questions that our clients and the people we work with are asking themselves every day. And if we think about it from that perspective, and also how the dynamic of how people think about that identity over time, there used to be a lot of compassion about the identity of a homeless person. And that level of compassion has changed quite dramatically over the last few years, the last couple of decades. And so when our clients have to identify with themselves, the last thing they want to identify with is that experience. And so that is part of the struggle of being able to get through the conversations, the interactions we have to have with our clients, because it brings about such a negative impression when people identify as homeless, even after you get through the series. And always reflect upon when I first got to Washington, D.C., how I never talked about my experience as a homeless person. And when I started to talk about it, there was absolutely a different appearance of respect that I got from people across the table, because the identity of homelessness is very different than the person I look like today. But when people are talking to you, they're seeing that identity in the way that you were when you were going through that experience. And that's why people move on. So I just wanted to touch on that, because this is a two-way street. It's dynamic, it's ever changing. And, especially if we think about what we're doing here, we're racial equity partners. And this is also about how people see the identity of race in our country and how that's transformed over time. So I just wanted to ask people to reflect on that. The people that are across the table for you, how are they answering these questions that we just asked? And that's why cultural humility is so important, because it gives us the opportunity to understand what that person across the table from us is thinking about, their self-awareness and reflection when they're working with us. So I just wanted to share.
Beautiful, Donald. No, I love that. That was so well said, right? So thinking on that other end too, with every individual that we meet, right? That this process, right, is there. And, part of this is also one of the things, and if you caught this in the video earlier, really kind of beautifully Melanie Turvalon kind of brings up, right? Being open to also just not knowing and being vulnerable, where we're sharing of ourselves. So it opens up and allows others to also share, right? And so this becomes really important, because a lot of times there's also identities that are also invisible, right? And so, you know, we don't always understand or know everybody's different kinds of social identities. And so allowing room and space for that becomes really important, whether we're thinking about race or whether we're thinking about, you know, in our shelters systems as people come in, a lot of our youth who are LGBTQI Two-Spirit plus, right? We have a lot of work to do. We don't have a lot of inclusive spaces in our world, but especially even within services that we're offering, right? And so how do we think about that, right? Think about these different identities and language and interactions, all of that. And I love it. And making sure we remember how things are always changing too, right? So we may have had one experience with one individual, but the next individual, you know, it could be a very different experience, right? Because those identities are carried very differently in some ways.
There was a comment in the chat about
Yes.
Robin DiAngelo as well.
Ah, yes, absolutely. This week has started White Fragility. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Veronica, for sharing that. Yeah, really, White Fragility is a great book, and Robin DiAngelo has quite a few things out that are really helpful to start to think about a lot of this work, right? And there's a host of, if you all are interested in good reads, right? Donald and I, between the two of us, we can give you all some good reads, right? Tons of good books. We're really lucky, I feel like, especially if you look at the past decade and even the past 5 years, we've had some really critical works come out, right? So, you know, from authors like Robin DiAngelo, but also, you know, Ibram X. Kendi, right? Ibram has come out with some great works from Stamped all the way to How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us. I don't know if anybody's read, but that came out very recently, really good book. Isabel Wilkerson's book, Cast. There's a lot of different books that have kind of come out that give us the opportunity to also know and learn a little deeper, but also give us the space to start to know, you know, even the questions that we need to be asking, right, of ourselves and of others and our communities. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, and Veronica, I'm just reading your chat comment. I was first found out at when George Floyd Memorial Square. Yeah, and it was at the cafe. Awesome, awesome. Yeah, and you think about a lot of the just our movements that have been launched just in the past few years, right? And that has also, that goes back into even our collective understanding of things like race, right, as Donald brought up, and all of this kind of shifting. So I love that. Thank you. And you all feel free to share. If you all have some other books that you want to share in the chat box that you are reading right now, or that you've been kind of checking out, that's great, because I think we can all continue to learn from each other and add to our own personal toolboxes, which is also a very big part of cultural humility, right? It asks us to continually share out. We don't kind of hoard, but it's like, if you know something, if you have a resource, let's share. Let's continue to share and help each other in this work. So I love that. Thank you for sharing. Okay, awesome. So thinking about, you know, really thinking about kind of these different dimensions. So again, going back, we looked at intrapersonal. Here is the interpersonal, right? Again, relationships, challenging power imbalances, advocacy, activism, right? So thinking about that, how do we also bridge the dimensions, right? So Haley says, you know, to meaningfully kind of engage with cultural humility on an individual and institutional level requires a third dimension that bridges the intrapersonal and interpersonal dimensions. And this bridging dimension encompasses openness and accountability. And that's what you saw in the Venn diagram, right in the center, right, was that connected piece of being open, and then also into the action piece, holding ourselves and holding our communities and institutions accountable, right? And then here's some from my work, right? For institutional and systems level changes to occur, working to understand and embrace the interconnections between intrapersonal and interpersonal dimensions of cultural humility are imperative, and it necessitates individual and collective work, right? Ongoing individual and collective work. So it's not enough just to do the individual self-reflection and self-critique. We also have to make sure that we're working together in our organizations and communities and groups to say we're going to take time to collectively reflect and to critique as well, right? To always ask ourselves, how can we grow? How can we learn? How can we continue to get better at being more equity-centered, right? That's really important to our work. I know just recently, an example of this I'll just share is, Donald and I and our National Coalition for the Homeless had a strategic planning weekend, right? Where we brought together staff and board members. And, sometimes you have to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations as well, right? But you have to be open. The cultural humility says we're open to that. Right? We're going to be open to kind of going there into those messy spaces instead of just avoiding, especially with the commitment to lifelong learn and to grow together, right? To get to a stronger and better place. And so that's a lot of that work. It's individual and collective work. So here we see, especially from the Scholarship of Rights, 6 conditions of systems change. So when we think about that piece of cultural humility, we're building, right? So last week, we talked a lot about kind of the inner reflection, but now thinking about and moving into even how do we think about systems level change? How do we think about starting to ask these bigger questions to really push and to, address and to challenge power imbalances that exist in our world and in our own spheres, right, of influence. And so you can start to think about different conditions of systems change. Policies, practices, right, resource flows, how are resources shared, thinking about relationships and connections, power dynamics, and then even mental models. Right. And so this triangle that you see looks at different conditions of systems change, takes it from structural change, right, all the way into that transformative change, right? So kind of operating. And again, it's a spectrum, right? You're kind of moving across this in different ways, hopefully, and you're constantly doing the work to kind of examine and to look at, right? So an example might be you're going back into your own policies, right? And asking some of the critical questions. Within these policies, right, are we honoring and thinking about and affirming diversity and diverse perspectives? What about our practices, right? As we're doing our practice, right, are we incorporating some of the new knowledge that we learn coming out of our own practice of cultural humility, where maybe somebody brings up. So I think a good example of this, last week we talked about, right? Donald kind of brought up and said, in some spaces, right, in certain older generations, pronouns were not something that were always shared, right? So Donald had a great example of this last time, right? And so it may feel hard to first incorporate that, right? Or say, why should we incorporate that? But being open to learning and understanding, right? And once you learn and understand, saying, I'm going to start to make sure that I try to integrate that into my work and help to compassionately, right, educate others into understanding the importance. And we know, right, that even something like, sharing pronouns, right, can have a huge, this comes from many of our communities, right? And so, in LGBTQI, P2 Spirit Plus, but even looking at kind of our trans communities, right, it can make a huge difference, right, when we allow space for that and we don't make assumption of pronouns, which is often what we often do, right, based on, visual cues or identities. But in fact, understanding that everybody has, different pronouns. We can't just assume someone's gender, right? And so this is very important. And these have real connections. Right, at surface level, it's not just about making the immediate space inclusive, but you start to actually see how when it's not inclusive, it actually has connections into systemic, even violence. So this goes into saying, well, even when we talk about the overrepresentation of hate crimes and deaths in our trans communities, but specifically unhoused trans communities, that calls on all of us to say, hey, right? This is a moment we need to be culturally humble here and to learn and to listen to lived experiences, to look at the power imbalances and to work to change that, because there's human lives, right, on the other end of that. And so there's these real connections there. And again, last week we really talked about on the right, we talked about some of the different core values, but on the left, we have something new to introduce here, right? The 5 R's of cultural humility: reflection, respect, regard, relevance, resiliency. And look at the alignment in this circle. It's not just about thinking. It's not just about feeling. It's not just about doing, but it's actually all of these things, right? It's that alignment. And that's something that's a goal and a process, and an ongoing goal and process. We have to constantly work at it, right? And it can be hard, it can be messy, but it's worth working at. Now, also very quickly, right, we bring up again last week these 3 kinds of critical principles of cultural humility. We bring it up again. If you were with us last week, right, we want to re-emphasize these principles because they're core to cultural humility. If you're just joining us this week, right, take a look at this. ICF will actually send out the PowerPoint afterwards in the recording, so you can go revisit and feel free to share out. But these 3 principles are something I often take time, even in my own life, to go back and reflect. Right? To say, let me look at these cultural humility principles and really start to think about ways to deepen that work in my own life. Right? And then there's some good questions here that we have for everyone to think about at an individual level, from an organizational and institutional level, and then finally thinking about gaps and areas for growth. Right? The individual and institutional kind of reflective level, right? And we're not going to get into this today because of time. We won't have a big discussion, but we're going to challenge everybody to take a look at this, right? And add this also to your own reflective kind of processes and tool bank of regularly thinking about. There's a lot of good benefits to that. So last week, again, we looked at some of the differences between competence to humility. And today we've deepened our understanding, hopefully, right, collectively, of cultural humility, right? Taking it to understand it's not only starting with that reflection of ourselves, right? Reflection of understanding and learning from others, saying, competence says I'm the expert, right? I've taken all these trainings and I'm competent, I'm an expert. No, cultural humility says we're always learning. It doesn't matter how many workshops we've gone to, how much work we've done around this, we're always having to learn, lifelong learning, right? And we're going to honor the expertise and truth and beauty, divine beauty of different people's journeys and stories. And we're going to learn from that, be open to learning from that, right? So again, that lifelong process. And again, understanding too, that there's no one best practice or fit, that we have to be able to adapt as well. Again, going back to the kaleidoscope, right? Because of the changing nature and dynamic nature of culture. And again, we're not going to go through these today in detail, but we bring these up here as, again, different kinds of ways to understand cultural humility, that these are all different understandings of what cultural humility is, goals, and both concepts that we can integrate into our lives, right? That we can really integrate into our lives in very real ways. And I'm going to actually turn the mic back over to Donald.
Thank you, Rajni, and thank you again for a really deep dive into the issues. And another way to really think about this entire thing is we've gone through this series of trainings that really lead us to a place where we have responsive and organizations that are accountable when it comes to racial equity and inclusion, and services that are equal across the board. And the way we get there, kind of the next step in getting there, is what we're doing today. We're talking about cultural humility, and that cultural humility will allow all those other things, the history, all the spheres of influence that we talked about, to get us to that next place in our service delivery. So we're delivering equitable services because we're interrogating ourselves. We're learning critical awareness and cultural competency skills, and we're using those skills to learn more about others, and that allows us to deliver the services in an equitable way. So in this slide, we are talking about the knowledge, the attitudes, and the skills that are necessary to get to those improved outcomes. Community context, socio-political environment, environmental determinants of health, cultural protocols, cultural relevant organizational guidelines and community resources, increased engagement, acceptance, inclusion, and equity. All of the things we've been building to over this course. Having more people with lived experience in the positions that can provide the guidance for us as we deliver programs, making sure that at every level of our programs that we're making sure that people of color are included in all levels of those programs. And to do that, we have to change our attitudes, critical awareness of those cultural inequities, and that comes through that self-reflection. Respect for those cultural differences, and understanding what kind of help and assistance we need to make sure that there's an environment where people can grow and become leaders and move through our system in a way that they are a part of the decision-making process. Openness, empathy, resilience, motivation to learn about cultures is so important. Making culturally safe, respectable, mutual understanding, all of those again are the building blocks for us to get the skills that we need to create equitable communities. And there's a lot of really important things we have to do. We talked a lot about our awareness and self-monitoring, our cross-cultural communication. And the only way you get there is to do that personal reflection, but also have the desire, the willingness, and the commitment to learn about other cultures. That's how you start to have that communication. Advocacy and action. It's not just enough to talk about making change and making equitable communities. It's an action step that we have to take. It's an action where we have to actively be in the process of doing that. And we do that through building relationships and rapport with the community around us, with other organizations, with people of color. And increase problem solving through new perspectives and strategies. When we find out that there are inequities, when we find out that there's an overrepresentation of people, we have to be committed to new strategies to be able to address that. More equitable organization service structures. I talked about that, not just having people of color in the front room, but they need to be in the C-suites as well. And when we do that, we improve the access to resources and support in the community. And it goes outward in the community as well, especially when it comes to the resources. We know that we have to understand, first of all, that groups that are led by people of color are under-resourced traditionally. They don't get foundation grants at the same level. So what do we do to improve that? How do we hold those philanthropic organizations accountable to make sure those resources are pouring into the places where those disparities exist? And then the reduction, all of that culminates in a reduction in disparities and inequity and improved individual outcomes for the people we serve, for the organizations we serve in, and for the community as a whole. But it starts with cultural humility and cultural awareness, and that's how we move all of what we've learned previously into action. And we really, really start to, one, interrogate ourselves, the community, and start to deliver equitable, improved outcomes in all of our communities. And So again, one of the things that is so important in culture of humility, the lifelong learning, diversity and power imbalances, we know that we have traditionally had the power imbalances. They continue on into our modern day workforce, into our modern day organizations and institutions, and we have to be reflective enough and critical enough and open enough to support the dialogue about change, but actually using action to get to that change. I want to always emphasize that action is so important. And it all comes with the respect and empowerment and optional learning, going outside of yourself, becoming your own historian, learning about the path that we use to get here and the path that we need to use to move forward. And these were adopted by Ferranda C. Baptiste, Reinhold Osman, and it's cultural humility, a concept analysis journey of transcultural nursing. And again, as Rajni said, a lot of the work around cultural humility really started in the medical world, in that space. And we know where that is another place where work really, really needs to be done. And if we haven't seen like the practical application of how cultural awareness and humility works, it is within that medical sphere. We had the pandemic, and we saw how the imbalance and the lack of cultural humility and cultural awareness really affected the outcomes in COVID-19. And all of the things we've talked about, the power of imbalance and not understanding those cultural norms, and also the history of culture, really had a disparate impact on people of color, Native Americans especially. There's a distrust of the medical system, and that distrust really had negative impacts on the outcomes. And part of that was because it took us so long to understand what these cultures, what were the barriers to getting the necessary resources to those cultures. It really prevented us from getting those resources out in time. And that's just a practical application of these concepts. And I'm going to stop there because I know we're short on time, but I wish.
Yeah, that was a great, wonderful example, Donald, as well, right? And I think beautifully said that, you know, and in healthcare too, even just looking at how, you know, maternal care and how many, you know, mothers die during birth, and then you start to see the overrepresentation, disproportionality of Black and brown, right, women. So there's a lot of things there that we could cover. So we have a short video clip here to play, and just to give you a little context, this is called the Unequal Opportunity Race. If you haven't seen it before, it's by the African American Policy Forum, and it's based on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a pioneering civil rights scholar, co-founder and executive director for the African American Policy Forum, but also a leader in Black feminist legal theory. And so I love Kimberly Crenshaw's work. Kimberly Crenshaw is actually the most cited women legal scholar in the history of law. So really has some great work out there. We just wanted to go ahead and share this. It's a very short kind of animation. So we wanted to share that, right? It's such a powerful, even though it's a short animation, there's a lot of different concepts in it, right? And really kind of showing how race, Black and brown individuals, there are certain systemic, right, challenges that affluent white individuals may not have to deal with, right, in terms of privilege, thinking about privilege and thinking about discrimination, limited opportunities, in terms of all of the disparities, right, pervasive housing discrimination, from the historical, right, thinking about slavery and segregation, lack of access to education, what that means and how that continues to play out, right, all the way into current day issues. And so, again, cultural humility, right, it asks us to reflect and to think about and not to feel guilty if we do have privilege, right, but to make sure that we're using that privilege as co-conspirators for good as well, right, that we're recognizing that and saying that, we're not going to perpetuate systems of oppression where it is hurting and even leading into early death, right, for certain individuals and communities, that we all have a part to question and to change that. And so, there's a lot there, right? But one of the things I love about cultural humility is it also operates from a strengths-based ideology. It asks us to always remember that individuals are capable and have agency, right? And that agency for change, that sphere for influence begins with us. And so this is, we wanted to give, right, kind of one model here that can be helpful in terms of embracing and practicing cultural humility. And so we gave a sneak peek last week, and we wanted to take a few minutes just to talk through this week. This is called the HUMBLE model, and HUMBLE stands for an acronym, right? HUMBLE being a core element as well of cultural humility. And the H, right, says we're going to be humble about the assumptions that we make. We're going to be humble and understand that often our assumptions are maybe incorrect, right? And we need to be open to really be in a place of humility and be humble in our learning. That we're going to understand our own background and culture, Again, this is one of the differentiations between competence, where the focus is only understanding others' background and cultures, where cultural humility says we're going to start by also understanding our own background and culture, because that shapes a lot of our lenses, right? A lot of the ways we're probably interacting with the world. M says we're going to motivate ourselves to learn more about other people's backgrounds, cultures, stories, right? Journeys. We're gonna learn and be open to learning and listening, in active listening in layers. Also actively, embracing empathy and practicing empathy, which is a skill set, really falls in here. The B, after we kind of are doing this ongoing reflective work, we're taking it into action, right? We're going to begin to incorporate this knowledge into our work. L, lifelong learning, right? Again, Veronica, I just got to say, I love that that's your school's motto. That has made me so happy today. Lifelong learning. E, emphasize respect and negotiate, right? Kind of plans of change, right? So when we think about even any kind of plan, right, that we're doing it in respectful, equity-centered partnerships. And so again, there's a lot of different models and approaches. We wanted to share this one today, and it comes from Cultural Humility to Navigate Change. It's kind of adapted from that, but you can play with this, right? This acronym may be helpful as you kind of start to embrace and practice cultural humility. Now, on the right, you again see the core tenets from Tervalan and Marie Garcia's kind of envisionment of cultural humility. Self-reflection, addressing inequity, that the process is always mutually beneficial, right? And that there is institutional accountability, which to me is also tied with that addressing inequity, right? So again, very interwoven. So we have again here, we don't have much time. We have about 2 minutes left, but we wanted to give you a snapshot and peek into next week. So we hope those of you here are going to return next week so we can continue to dive in together into this work. Next week, we're going to move into some more reflective activity, really moving theory into action. We're going to do some different critical reflections, including to This Is One, right? Kind of a trailer for next week. We're going to talk about really thinking about cultural values, lessons that we can learn. How can we continue to learn and grow together and as individuals? Donald?
Sorry, I always have a little bit of challenge getting off mute. So just thank you all for being here today. I think we probably have said it all, and I hope people are getting the connection between where we started with the historical analysis and how the 101 is that, and then getting into the 200 series is what we're doing now. We're moving from idea to action and actually really putting in place the strategies and the tools necessary to make sure that what we started with was increasing our spheres of influence in our work, making equitable workspaces. This is what we're talking about now, and we look forward to the third part of this series.
Awesome. We're going to turn it back over to Kristen, who's been our Oz behind the screens here helping us as well. Kristen?
Well, thank you so much, Rajni and Donald. That was yet another great series or great session, and I'm definitely looking forward to next week as well. And to all of you who participated today, thank you for attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on the next Racial Equity series, which will, of course, be Cultural Humility, Part C, 1 week from today. A 3-question survey will pop up as this session ends. Please provide your feedback so we can ensure these training sessions are as useful as possible. And we thank you so much for your participation and wish everyone a really nice day. Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Namaste.